Dave Smith and I were debating the war in Gaza. And I started talking here about what actually is genocide under international law, and I started quoting the Geneva Conventions there, and I started quoting combatant to civilian death ratios and how this is the most humane civilian to combatant death ratio in the entire history of urban warfare. And I kid you not, he just says, but look at all the rubble. The reason for Israel to try to wrap this thing up ASAP, the longer this goes on there, the more difficult it's going to be for Israel to win the PR war because they've lost it, but just to really just contain the damage. There is simply no interest that is served here other than pure, unabashed appeasement of the domestic Muslim voting population. That, to me, is what exactly is going on here in Australia, France, the UK, Canada.
When the bell tolls for Jews, it tolls for all mankind.
When you are unable fundamentally to discern between who is morally right and who is morally wrong, between a horrific, barbaric group of radical Islamic jihadists and the state of Israel, the Jewish people, the original people of the book, then you have reached the point where you are fundamentally struggling with the most basic questions in humanity.
Joshua Hammer is the author of Israel and Civilisation, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. He's a syndicated columnist through Creators Syndicate, senior editor-at-large for Newsweek, and host of his own show, The Josh Hammer Show. He's a very accomplished thinker and writer, and a very sharp observer of what I would call loosely our civilizational moment. I think you'll find this an important and gripping conversation. Joshua, thank you very much for giving up some of your time. You're a very busy guy in the United States, and appreciate very much you coming on.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, in your recent book, Israel and Civilisation, shorthand title, you write of our perilous moment, what other thinkers like Os Guinness might describe almost as our civilizational moment. What do you mean by our perilous moment?
So, John, I wrote this book, Israel and Civilization, not necessarily in response to the October 7th, 2023 pogrom by the barbarians of Hamas against Israel, but I wrote the book in response to the pogrom. Right. So the world had a very clear moment there in the hours and the days, the weeks, the months, as it were, after October 7th, to look at the situation where you had a 7th century Islamist death cult, a group that aspires to return its would-be caliphate to the 7th century, a group whose founding charter, which is publicly available, by the way, the Hamas charter is available for all to see. It calls for the death not merely of all Jews, but also of all so-called infidels, by which they, of course, mean Christians and, frankly, non-Sharia supremacist Muslims as well. So the world had a very crisp and clean opportunity, that is, to look at this dichotomy between this horrific group of Islamist barbarians on the one hand and the free and flourishing state of Israel, the literal home of the Bible, on the other hand. And the world struggled. The world struggled mightily. Opinion makers, thought leaders, political leaders, elected officials, commentators, everyone seemed to struggle with who to side here. You know, I think it was actually one day after, it was October 8th, if memory serves, 2023, at Harvard University, purportedly the greatest institution of education in America, if not the world. You had 33 student groups. While the blood was still dry, literally the Hamas terrorists were still running throughout Israel. They had not even captured all of them yet. And the 33 Harvard student group leaders affixed their names to a letter saying that the Jews of Israel were morally culpable. They were responsible for their own barbaric genocide, for the butchering of babies in ovens, the execution of Holocaust survivors, execution style in their kitchens, the mass raping and sexual violence and pillaging, all of that there. So, you know, John, that does take us to what you aptly described to as a civilizational moment or a civilizational wake-up call, when you are unable fundamentally to discern between who is morally right and who is morally wrong, between a horrific, barbaric group of radical Islamic jihadists and the state of Israel, the Jewish people, the original people of the book, then you have reached the point where you are fundamentally struggling with the most basic questions in humanity there. So that really is where I begin in my book, Israel and Civilization there. And we start talking in those early chapters of the book what is Western civilization? Fundamentally, only a people that understands what their civilizational inheritance is, only who they are, what they stand for, only a people, a group of nations, a group of peoples collectively, only those folks who understand the answers to those questions will be well equipped in order to fight for them. It doesn't make any sense, after all, that we would be willing and able, perhaps even eager, to fight back against the forces that threaten to conquer and subjugate us if we don't even know who we are, what we stand for in the first place there. So I argue pretty forthrightly in the book. There's the classical formation of Western civilization. So the American political scientist Leo Strauss, longtime University of Chicago political scientist, he's really credited above all with, I think, popularizing the notion that what we today call Western civilization is this fusion of reason and revelation, of the Greco-Roman tradition of reason with revelation, Jerusalem, and the Bible itself. In the book, I actually really argue, I accept that premise, but I argue that if one is going to be even more important to what we call Western civilization, it's actually the Bible. It's actually civilization. It's actually revelation there. And I argue the Western civilization actually began with God's revelation to Moses and the Israelites at Mount Sinai, and that it is the original people of the book and what a pope famously described to as the great Gentile offshoot, Christendom more generally. That is what built Western civilization there. So if we're going to ultimately put Humpty Dumpty back together again and fortify us to ultimately withstand these hegemonic forces, these very, very real threats that we face there, we have to understand who we are and what we stand for there. And to me, the Judeo-Christian civilizational inheritance, the biblical inheritance itself, that is the crux, the core of what it means to be the West. And that is why I think the October 7, 2023 pogrom was a horrific assault, not merely for the Jewish people, not merely for the Jewish state, but for Western civilization as such.
It might be said that a civilization is an entity that arises when enough people agree on enough, and you've painted that agreeing on enough as being reason and rationality, for long enough to become something that is recognizably an age, if you like. And I guess the latter 80 years or so, what we now call the liberal global order, might be seen as certainly the most influential and far-reaching point our civilization has reached. My point is, and I think I'm probably preaching to the choir with what you're saying, is that we have come to seriously doubt the centerpiece of the, if you like, the ideas around the fuel on which we have built this civilization ourselves. We're actually quite hostile to it, I would suggest, many in our culture. It's not just that they've forgotten, they're actually hostile to it.
No, deeply hostile as such. So, John, among the hats that I wear is I'm also a lawyer by background here. I speak at law schools. I've published constitutional law scholarship here in American legal circles. And, in the last chapter of the book, Israel and Civilization, I make an argument that perhaps would be unexpected for someone who's just picking up the book, actually, which is that I argue that the entire American constitutional notion, but it's probably similar in Australia and a lot of other first world Anglophone countries, I would imagine, I argue that this notion of so-called separation of church and state, at least in the American context, is very much a historical and legal misnomer, because it has had both the legal and the cultural effect of telling people of faith, which in America, yes, means Jews, but really above all means Christians, of telling them that you cannot bring your faith, your morality, your deducing of logic and public policy and law from scriptural biblical precepts. We're told that religious Jews and Christians here in the U.S. are not allowed to bring any of that into the public square. And it's just totally, completely ludicrous. And I think large swaths of elites throughout the West, certainly in the United States, have really kind of imbibed the notion that what made the United States great, what made Western civilization great, is not to actually stand for truth, not actually stand for core convictions, but to really not necessarily stand for everything at all. For anything at all, to really stand for this notion of live and let live, let the chips fall where they may. We kind of pride ourselves on our relativism, on our being so thoroughly and passionately agnostic between competing claims. This is what I would argue has led to the rise partially of things like like transgenderism, like this debate as to whether or not a biological male can become a female simply because he thinks it is such and so forth there. Who are we to say? Who are we to say that something is true or something is false? Whatever. Let the chips fall where they may. So this is all part of the issue there. But again, what I argue, and what I think a lot of great conservatives have argued there, I'm hardly the first to make this point, is that what made Western civilization great is not moral agnosticism. It is not relativism as to competing claims of truths and falsities. Rather, what has made Western civilization great is that we are unafraid to proclaim what the truth actually is. And above all, we are able to deduce those truths from the Bible. So throughout the earlier chapters of the book in particular, before I get into contemporary foreign policy and the state of Israel and Zionism and things like that, a lot of the earlier chapters, John, of the book, Israel and Civilization, are really dedicated to just explicating how so many of not just the laws, but also just the day-to-day background, implicit morals that make society function, essentially, how much that is really derived from the Hebrew Bible. And there's so many examples here. I guess I would just offer just one, which is this notion of the golden rule, which I was taught back when I was in kindergarten, that you shall do to others, you shall treat others as you would like to be treated. Now, I went to public school here. I live in Florida. I went to public school in New York State where I grew up. I was not told that had a religious valence or anything. As it turns out, it really is actually directly derived from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, the injunction that you shall treat the stranger as your own fellow. That's basically the biblical antecedent of the golden rule. So part of my book is really just trying to remind people of the things that we have so long just taken for granted, because only then by appreciating those things and holding on to those things, holding on to these biblical truths, holding on to all the amazing things that both Judaism and Christianity have done for Western civilization, only then can we once again be great.
So it's really the Tom Holland thesis that Christianity and Judaism are in the air we breathe, even though we don't recognize it anymore. But you'd have to say the oxygen is thinning out pretty badly. It's pretty easy to paint a picture of the breakdown of trust, of relationship, of functionality, even of economics and prosperity in the West, seems to follow pretty much the trajectory of, if you like, the abandonment of faith. But ironically, with it, the abandonment of rationality and the idea of revelation, as you put it. You can actually see the fruits of what we're doing. That's a big part of what you're saying, I think. You can see it, and it's not attractive fruit.
No, it's not. And, kind of the flip side of the point that I was making a few minutes ago, how I would place a premium, frankly, if anything, put a thumb on the scale for revelation over reason if need be. I think it's worth reminding, a lot of folks these days, John, they say that they're just acting completely reasonably, they're acting completely rationally when they're doing things that to a sensible person seem patently unreasonable or patently irrational. And one of the things that I do as well in the earlier chapters is I remind folks that there is a long and somewhat sordid history of peoples, of nations, that have done things in the purported name of reason. They are trying to attach themselves to the vanguard, the moral high ground of reason, and then do a lot of absolutely horrific things in the name of reason. I don't think it would be much of an exaggeration, frankly, to say that much of what Nazi Germany did during World War II was done in the purported name of reason. After all, Germany was the most advanced country in the world at the time, the 1930s. They were the most advanced mathematically, scientifically, philosophically, music, literature. I mean, virtually every way, essentially, that you can measure a country in terms of its innovative capacity, they were at or near the top of the list. And when they were doing things such as the German theory of Lebensraum, which was what they called so-called compassion for the less fortunate, well, that's what led to eugenics, and then eugenics ultimately lead to the train tracks leading to Auschwitz and Treblinka. So the point of all of this exercise is kind of just to remind folks and making somewhat of a counter-cultural argument, making an argument that is just not particularly, shall we say, in tune with the times. But that's kind of my role to play as a conservative, trying to remind people of some earlier truths, is basically just trying to say that no, reason is not enough. That to simply just close your eyes and say I'm acting reasonably, that's actually really not enough. You genuinely do need something more than that. And for thousands and thousands of years, I think people who have built what today we call Western civilization readily understood. It was not even a shadow of a doubt. They understood that what is more than that is revelation. What is needed more than that is Scripture, is God, and is the Bible itself. And, you can believe all that without having any kind of specific theological claim about the role of the modern capital as the state of Israel. Certainly here in the United States, Christians, Protestants, Catholics alike disagree vociferously about what their various theological teachings say when it comes to the role or lack thereof of Israel. I'm an Orthodox Jew. Orthodox Jews, believe it or not, actually disagree passionately on this very topic as well there. But none of that is actually particularly relevant there, because if you believe in the foundation of Scripture, if you believe in the foundation of the Bible itself, then it does necessarily stand to reason that the literal home of the Bible, the Holy Land itself, home to the original people of the book there, this should be a fairly easy moral judgment to make when that people in that land is assaulted in the most barbaric, horrific fashion imaginable from 7th century aspiring radical Muslim jihadists there. So that's really the core argument, John, I would say, of the book.
I agree with you. Reason is not enough. I think the judge and jury is in on that one, if you like. You need more. Important as it is, you need more. So let's drill into that for a moment. Give us a feel for how we might understand what Judaism has brought to Western civilization. I'm conscious, for example, that the American founding fathers, many of them simply deists, not Jewish or Christian, but deists, and deeply steeped, I suppose you'd say, in the worldview that Judeo-Christianity had developed for them in their lives. So give us drill down into some examples of how we might understand what the Jewish faith in particular, say the book of Exodus, has brought us.
Yeah, so Exodus is a perfect place to start, actually. So the very first people that landed in what was then called Plymouth Colony, Massachusetts. So these were the original Pilgrims. They were the former Puritans in England, fleeing persecution there in England. When they sailed across the Atlantic Ocean on the Mayflower in the year 1620. They actually conscientiously viewed themselves. They deliberately envisioned themselves as being modern day Israelites fleeing their version of Egypt, seeking out their version of the Holy Land. And in fact, Sir William Bradford, who became the second governor of Plymouth Colony, he was the captain of the Mayflower, of these valiant 120, give or take, pilgrims there on the ship. Sir William Bradford actually spoke about 1,000 words of biblical Hebrew, because he himself was in turn a student of a well-known English Christian Hebraist, a very outdated term, by the way. Hebraist is someone who studies the language, the culture, the Bible, and so forth of the ancient Israelites and the Hebrews. So Sir William Bradford was a student of a well-known Christian Hebraist named Sir Henry Ainsworth. And there was actually even some chatter on the Mayflower itself. It didn't take off, but there was actually some preliminary chatter as to whether or not they would really kind of take their conviction to its logical conclusion and effectuate a clean break from the English language and therefore start speaking Hebrew when they landed, God willing, in the so-called New World. Now, it didn't happen, of course, there, but there was some chatter. And similarly, there actually was some very similar chatter in the 1780s following the American colonists' miraculous victory over the British Crown, the Battle of Yorktown. There was also some similar chatter about, we're about to start this new republic once and for all. Should we do what the Pilgrims almost did and start speaking Hebrew? Again, it didn't take off, but the point stands. And the reason for that is because the men who founded the United States, George Washington, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, some of them certainly were deists. Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine are very good examples. Many of them actually were though pretty conservative, lowercase o, Orthodox Christians. John Adams, John Jay, folks like that. And the type of Christianity, the type of theology that they believed in was a very strong Hebrew Bible foundation for the review of Christianity. So, for instance, noted deist Thomas Jefferson actually wanted, or he proposed, the Great Seal for the Commonwealth of Virginia, his home state, to actually be Moses leading the Israelites across the Red Sea. Benjamin Franklin similarly proposed the Great Seal of the United States, actually, to be Moses crossing the Red Sea with the Israelites there. In fact, the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, right across from Independence Hall, it's one of America's most iconic symbols of the Revolution and the early days of our republic. The Liberty Bell is famously inscribed on the outside, not with a verse from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, or not with a speech from Cicero on the floor of the Roman Senate. Rather, it is inscribed with a verse from Leviticus chapter 25, verse 10, Thou shalt proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. My personal favorite figure in American history, Abraham Lincoln, was a deeply, deeply biblically literate statesman. He quoted the Hebrew Bible over and over and over again in his speeches. Arguably, his most famous speech, perhaps other than the Gettysburg Address, was his pithy but extraordinarily eloquent second inaugural address, which he gave in 1865, tragically just about a month and a half before he was assassinated. And the closing line of his speech, which is universally quoted here in the States, he speaks of with charity, with malice for none, with charity for all, let us do the right, and as God gives us to right, to bind up the nation's wounds. This notion of binding up the nation's wounds is a direct copy and paste quote from Psalms chapter 147. Lincoln, by the way, famously referred to America in 1861, just prior to the Civil War's onset, as an almost chosen people, deliberately evoking this Hebrew Bible imagery. So all throughout American history, Ronald Reagan, final example, Ronald Reagan, an amazing 20th century president, of course, their conservative icon. Ronald Reagan was the one who famously kind of brought back that original pilgrim language of referring to the United States as a shining city on a hill, referring, of course, to Jerusalem, the original shining city on a hill. So all throughout American history, this notion of the story of the Israelites, fleeing oppression there. By the way, so much, and I know I keep on saying that I'm going to stop here, but very, very final point here. I apologize. Even so much of our Constitution. I mentioned again that I'm a lawyer. So let's just take one example here. So in recent years, we've had a fairly unprecedented prosecution of then former president, now current president Donald Trump, and our friends on the left over and over and over again said, "Oh, we have to prosecute Donald Trump because no man is above the law." Now, I agree with that assessment. I happen to disagree about what the law is. But more importantly, for present purposes, I would be curious if these folks understand where that notion that no man is above the law, where is it actually from? Well, it's actually literally from the book of Deuteronomy. So it's chapter 16, 17, right around there, this Deuteronomistic principle that the king in ancient Israel was actually not above the law. In fact, John Fortescue, an old conservative English common lawyer from the 1400s, when he codified that principle into the English common law that the king of England is not above the law, he literally directly cited the book of Deuteronomy for that proposition. So I mean, so much of the English common law of our Anglo-American Western civilizational inheritance, so much of it really does go back to the Hebrew Bible.
Do you find a remarkable reluctance from your, if you like, political and cultural opponents to actually engage in debate about the facts, as contrasted with a headlong rush towards trying to appeal to people's feelings and emotions? Ayan Hirsi says we're in danger of turning ourselves into an emocracy where we feel everything and think nothing.
Yeah, it's a very evocative term, emocracy. I haven't heard that from Ayan, but I like that a lot, actually. So, John, I've been friends with Ben Shapiro, the well-known conservative commentator here in the U.S. I've been friends with Ben for a long time. I actually used to work. I used to work for his company, The Daily Wire, and one of Ben's taglines that really kind of made him popular a decade ago was his notion that facts don't care about your feelings. And I think it probably was true, or at least we aspired that it was true back when he first started saying it. But I am sad to say that based on all my travels across the United States, my visits to university campuses, it simply is not true anymore. And that saddens me greatly. And I'll give you just one example here, which is I was debating a libertarian comedian by the name of Dave Smith. I've actually debated him twice this year. The most recent time was a Turning Point USA conference in Tampa, Florida. But the first time back in February, we debated at Princeton University in New Jersey. Now, Princeton is ranked every year by U.S. News and World Reports, which does these university rankings. It's ranked as the #1 university in America. So you would like to think that if there is any venue where these students are capable of logical reasoning, of facts and law and things like that, as opposed to sheer heart-pulling emotions, you would like to think that it was Princeton. But Dave Smith and I were debating the war in Gaza, and he accused Israel of genocide, which is a not uncommon, albeit utterly insane charge. And I started talking here about what actually is genocide under international law, and I started quoting the Geneva Conventions there, and I started quoting combatant to civilian death ratios and how this is the most humane civilian to combatant death ratio in the entire history of urban warfare, as crunched by the head of urban warfare studies at the United States Military Academy, and make all these points there. And then it's Dave Smith's turn to respond, and I kid you not, he just says, "But look at all the rubble." And he said that, and the audience, many people in the audience just started rapidly applauding there. So, I mean, to me, that was kind of a wake-up call, right? Which is that we simply are just dealing with an information age where facts only get you so far there. And this is something I think that that not merely the Jewish people, not merely the state of Israel, but really all Christians, all others who are defending our inheritance, who are defending facts and logic and truth from all the various falsities and temptations of the moment, is a very difficult lesson to intuit, and something that I'm still trying to kind of fully learn how to grasp and deal with it myself there. But nonetheless, I think that your question is totally sound, and your instinct is sound, which is that what Ayaan Hirsi Ali said is fundamentally correct, that we tragically are living in something of an emocracy these days.
Part of this irrationality is showing up, in the common sort of media spaces. I think of people like Candace Owen, Nick Fuentes, I don't know how you pronounce his name, among others. They have massive audiences in your country. We're seeing the equivalent here. And they're really just producing the tired old tropes that are almost endless. I mean, we're talking about a hatred that's gone back to the beginning of mankind, it seems, in some sections of the non-Jewish community for Jewish people. It is driven so much by emotion, so much by a refusal to engage with facts. What do you think this means for the safety of Jews in the West?
Look, I would be lying to you if I said that I were not concerned. I mean, Europe right now is probably the worst of the worst when we speak of the West more generally and the Jews. Although, frankly, here in North America, our northerly neighbors in Canada, it's getting quite bad. I live here in South Florida, where thankfully it's not much of an issue, but we have a lot of people from Canada who spend their winters here. So this past winter, I was hearing a lot about this from folks coming in from Toronto, Montreal, places like that there. But look, I mean, one can draw a pretty clean, direct line. And I'm speaking here in broad terms. My claim is obviously not that every individual Muslim is ipso facto inherently bigoted, but one can draw a pretty clear and direct line from the level of Islamic immigration that a Western country brings in and the level of anti-Semitism. That should not be a particularly controversial statement to say that. It simply just is the case. In fact, in recent years, I've done a couple of speeches in Budapest, Hungary, and Hungary is actually one of the only countries on the European continent that has been adamant against bringing in large swaths of Muslim migrants. And I spent a lot of time, my first trip to Budapest 3.5 years ago, I went to numerous synagogues, kosher restaurants, Jewish community centers there. So I spent a good amount of time in the Jewish part of Budapest. Not only does it feel totally safe, there's actually barely any security guards because it's just not much of it. It's not really an active concern there. So there's a very clear and direct line, I think, between the number of Islamic migrants and the level of anti-Semitism. But it's not just the Muslims, unfortunately. Here, in my book, I argue that much of it is the rise of what we refer to as contemporary wokeism, of leftist liberalism, cultural Marxism, whatever you want to refer to it there, and basically just this overarching mentality that has become one of the prevailing orthodoxies now in American higher education and American left-wing elite circles in general, which is this notion that we can, in kind of classic Marxist fashion, we can cleanly divide society into a dichotomy, but instead of the old Marxist economic dichotomy of the patricians and the plebeians or the proletariat, rather the woke say that you can divide society into the oppressors and the oppressed. And Christians certainly are oppressors in this ridiculous, oversimplified dichotomy. Somehow the Jews end up being oppressors too, which frankly is news to me. I'm not sure how anyone can read the history of mankind and conclude that the Jews are anything other than the most oppressed people ever. But this is not, this is not me. This comes from the left wing wokerati, shall we say there. And this combination of bringing in Muslim immigration combined with the metastasis and the ubiquity in many places of this left-wing woke ideology really has created a very toxic environment, I think, for Jewish people. But Christians are really not far behind. And this is another point to my book, John, Israel and Civilization, which is to argue repeatedly throughout this book that anti-Semitism here, there, and everywhere, going back for thousands of years, it's never about the Jews. It is virtually never, ever, ever about the Jews. It is symptomatic of something more broadly going wrong in society there. And what starts with the Jews, also we know, never, never ends with the Jews. I mentioned Karl Marx. Marx is actually a perfect example to illustrate this point. Marx himself was the grandson of an Orthodox rabbi. He himself was Jewish under Jewish law, but he harbored a seething hatred, a visceral resentment of the Jewish people. He had this infamous anti-Semitic essay in the 1840s on the Jewish question, which is really quite ugly. But we also know that Marx's ultimate goal was not the eradication of the Jewish people. His ultimate goal was the eradication of capitalism, of Christendom, of that which free enterprise and Christianity have built all throughout the West there. So he really understood what anti-Semites have understood going back thousands of years, that in order to actually get to the real peoples who built Western civilization, that's the Christians. That's Christendom there. Christianity is what actually built Western civilization. But in order to get to Christianity, it necessarily makes sense that you start with the original people of the book. It's really diabolical, but frankly, it also makes some degree of sense. So I suppose give diabolical credit where diabolical credit is due.
An interesting reflection of what you're saying is that not so long ago, one of our outstanding prime ministers from the other side of politics to me, that is to say the left, Bob Hawke, made the comment that when the bell tolls for Jews, it tolls for all mankind. Contrast that with the very left-wing prime minister we have in Australia at the moment, who in deciding to recognise Palestine, I don't know how you recognise a state that isn't a state, doesn't have an identifiable form of government. Nonetheless, he's been openly congratulated by Hamas, a terrorist organisation, for his actions. This sort of movement on the part of the left to one of recognising the horrors of racism in general and of anti-Semitism to one where they're quite full-bloodedly willing to condemn both Israel and I think by implication very often, at least turn a blind eye to anti-Semitism. What's happened on the left that's allowed this to happen, particularly given, if I may say so, that in this country anyway, most Jewish people are to the left of centre themselves?
So I think what you're seeing here is the formation of what I refer to as the so-called red-green alliance. This alliance between Marxists and Islamists of various stripes there. And we've seen this kind of play out a few times over the past decade or so. So I think back pretty often to a woman named Linda Sarsour, who was the head of the so-called Women's March back in 2017. This is a group of feminists who were marching in ostensible opposition to the incoming fascist dictatorship, in their own words, of President Donald Trump. Now, Linda Sarsour is a Muslim who wears a hijab, who also has a long and colorful history of apologizing on behalf of Sharia law. So her Twitter history at that time had some very peculiar tweets talking about how Sharia law is very favorable when it comes to maxing out your credit card and bank loans and interest payments there. But, no one thought to ask Linda Sarsour what Sharia law has to say about, I don't know, feminism or women's. I mean, she was leading the Women's March after all there, right? But it's very much kind of an enemy of my enemy is my friend type situation there, because there's very, very little that Marxists and Islamists have in common other than that they want to destroy the West. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of this exercise there, is to eradicate any biblical Judeo-Christian taint there. And again, it really does always start with the Jews, because the enduring nature of the Jewish people going back thousands of years, to me, that this is really the original reason that anti-Semitism exists. Because the fact that Jewish people endure, that we keep to our laws, we keep to our particular relationship with God and so forth there, this is an enduring, nagging anchor on the Western conscience. It is a perpetual reminder that there is such thing as truth, and that there is such thing as this small particular group of people that are going to live their entire lives in accordance with that truth. So if your goal is to implement a relativistic society, a post-truth, post-modern society there, again, for very similar reasons, it makes a lot of sense that you actually start with the Jewish people, and likewise, the Christians will come next, because they are also, Christianity, of course, is also a biblical religion, but it really does always start with the Jews. But this red-green alliance, now we're seeing it come again here in New York City with the likely incoming mayoralty of Zoran Mamdani, who himself is a far, far, far left quasi-Marxist, full-on, to me, he seems like a full-on Marxist, frankly. So he's a Marxist, but also he's a Muslim. He's not an Islamist. He doesn't want to implement Sharia law, but he does take the identity politics aspect of his Islamic background there, at least when it comes to his anti-Zionism and his anti-Semitism there. So this really is kind of the threat that I see it, is this notion of the red-green alliance there. The question arises, is the United States, is Western civilization as a whole going to fight back against this red-green alliance there? And to me, that question can only be answered by doing the things that I call for it to do in the book, which is to basically double down and recover its ecumenical Judeo-Christian biblical inheritance, because that is what made us great as Western people, and that is the only thing truly that will make us great once again.
To be fair, it isn't only the left. There are those who might be, if you like, further out on the right wing of the centre-right spectrum, someone like Tucker Carlson, who in recent times appears to have been extremely critical as well. What's happening there, in your view? Because we've always thought of the centre and the centre-right in America as being extremely supportive of Israel.
Well, it really has been for the most part. And to be clear, for the most part, it still is today. So if you actually look at so Gallup here is one of our major public pollsters. If you look at the Gallup poll provided percentage of registered Republicans who supports Israel's war in Gaza, it's actually completely unchanged from, I think, November 2023 until now. So the support's been very steady. It's in the 70 to 75% range there. So for the most part, that support is holding steady. However, with that large caveat aside, you're completely right that there is absolutely the rise of this wing of provocateurs who range from being anti-Semitic to just being, frankly, just outright anti-Western. I mean, the way that I view someone like Tucker Carlson, I do think that he is absolutely anti-Semitic at this point. All you have to do is you listen to the way that he talks about how the New Testament doesn't need the Hebrew Bible. He's essentially made that argument there. The way he talks about how arguments offered by various Jews here in the U.S., such as Ben Shapiro, Mark Levin, are positively unchristian. He says a lot of things that really kind of give away the game there. But I look at folks like Tucker, and I really do think that he fundamentally actually has a deep abhorrence, not just of Jewish people, but really of Western civilization itself. I mean, this is a guy who had a very friendly puff piece interview with the so-called president of Iran, who was just the Ayatollah Khamenei's puppet essentially there. This is someone, Tucker Carlson, who was in Moscow, Russia a year and a half ago, who was doing propaganda-like videos from the Moscow subway station and the Moscow supermarket. I mean the kind of stuff that would have made Bernie Sanders from the 1980s during the Soviet era, frankly, blush. So you have a lot of folks here that have really kind of drank this anti-Western civilizational Kool-Aid. And the best way that I can possibly try to make sense of it, not that it's necessarily my role to try to make sense of anti-Semitism, but the best way that I can try to understand what's happening here is there's been a very real populist uprising in the United States over the past 10-ish years, really kind of since Donald Trump came down the escalator there. And part of this populist uprising has been I think it's a very correct point, a correct rebuke of American elites, of the American ruling class. Again, I've made that argument myself. I fundamentally share it. I think that American elites have really kind of steered this country dramatically off course for a very long time. The problem, though, and the logical leap that I think people like Tucker often make, is they then conflate the American ruling class, let's call it, with America itself. So that they then think that it's not merely the American ruling class that has made us bad, but rather it's actually America itself. So that's kind of how you end up with this paradoxical point where they're making the so-called quote-unquote America First case to embolden America's enemies, to embolden China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and so forth there. It really doesn't make any sense when you actually start to break it down there. But again, to end on a positive note, the polling for the American Right of Center is still generally holding up. So following President Trump's courageous and very limited intervention in the 12-day war between Israel and Iran back in June, where he sent in the B-2 bombers, roughly a 37-hour mission. The planes fly from Missouri to Iran and back. Not a single shot was fired. A tremendous act of courage and just a demonstration of unmitigated American military superiority. After that, there was a poll from CBS News, another major American pollster, that showed that 94% of self-proclaimed MAGA Republicans supported President Trump's limited strikes on Iran there. So this notion that Donald Trump's MAGA coalition is populated with full-on isolationists simply is not, it's not evinced by the actual polling data. That does lead to the logical question as to what exactly are Tucker Carlson and those folks trying to do there when it comes to trying to stake out a 6% market share position. I think that kind of gets into the realm of things like bot activity, Iranian, Qatari bots on social media, things like that. There's also just a very loud segment that is kind of taking these positions there. They're not numerous, but they're very loud there. Ultimately, though, I remain cautiously optimistic, at least when it comes to an American perspective. Although I would very candidly say that if I were talking to one of my fellow Jews who was living in London or Paris, I would say, you might want to strongly consider moving to Israel. That's my very candid stance about Jews there. But in the United States, things for now are still totally fine, especially in Florida where I live, where things are frankly just totally quite normal.
We have seen some Jews, and I know there have been some prominent Jews in America, Noam Chomsky might be one, who themselves don't seem to support Israel, that might call themselves anti-Zionists even. What explains, how do we understand that?
So there's a few ways to unpack this. By the way, John, this has been one of my biggest source of frustration since I was in middle school. So I was one of those guys who was the token conservative all the way back in middle school there. I went to public school growing up, but many of my friends were Jewish. They were predominantly all on the left there. So I was kind of the guy in high school defending the Bush administration's treatment of Al-Qaeda terrorists at Guantanamo Bay, essentially against 20 to 25 liberal classmates, many, not all, but many of whom were Jewish. So I've been frustrated with this for a very, very, very long time, which is the leftward nature of the American Jewish population, and definitely included in this is an Israel skepticism, if not anti-Israel sentiment. Now, to be clear, the polling, because I care about stats, I care about numbers here. The polling does show that American Jews overall remain overwhelmingly supportive of Israel. So the percentage of Jews that call themselves pro-Israel hovers between 70 and 90%, depending on the poll, but it still is actually very, very high. Now, what these folks mean by pro-Israel depends a little bit there. But the number one reason, in my judgment, and this is kind of a charged thing that I'm going to say, but I will say it anyway. But the number one thing in my judgment that has led to so many American Jews, Western Jews, but really I would say American Jews even more so than Canadian, British, Australian Jews. The number one thing that I think has made American Jews go so far politically left and many times has been the utter dilution of Judaism itself. So you really have the pronounced rise and the spread of theologically liberal strands of Judaism. And I know here of what I speak. I was raised in a Reformed Jewish setting. I've become religious. I've become Orthodox here in my young adulthood there. But fundamentally, theologically liberal Judaism, by the way, much like theologically liberal Christianity, which similarly rejects Christian tradition, theologically liberal Judaism rejects Jewish tradition. Fundamentally, it rejects the binding nature of halakha, of Jewish law. It rejects all of the core tenets, really, of the actual Jewish religion there. Well, what is one of the foremost core tenets of the Jewish religion there? Is that God promised the land of Israel to the children of Israel. That's the entire notion of the covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and so forth there. One of the single most popular leitmotifs throughout the 5 books of Moses, throughout the entire Hebrew Bible in general. So when you start from a logical starting place where what Judaism means to you is really just social justice activism when it comes to open borders, when it comes to global warming, environmentalism, when it comes to abortion on demand. If that is what quote unquote Judaism means to you, and if Judaism does not mean to you to actually do the commandments, to pray 3 times a day, to keep the Sabbath, to honor your father and mother, when Judaism means the former and not the latter, you're going to go off the rails very, very quickly there. And I'm not terribly surprised that some sort of distance, if not outright hatred of the land of Israel, then tends to pop up quite often for these folks as well.
It does seem to me that even a secular Jew, and there are many in Israel, many secular Jews in Israel, it seems illogical for them not to see clearly that particularly people who have been as oppressed, as we said earlier, and so poorly treated for so long, you'd think there would be that deep commitment to a homeland, to the recognition that, if you like, loosely speaking, Christians have many places they can call home, whether it's America, Australia, whatever. You could argue that the same of Muslims. There are many Muslim countries. But there's only one Jewish state, and it seems to be the one that everybody else agrees perhaps could be sacrificed. And no one, this is the whole thesis you're making, the price of losing Israel, and it's not beyond the realms of possibility that it won't survive. Without America today, I wonder where Israel would be. You may have a view on that. But without Israel, the world will be a very much more dangerous place for a lot of people, I would have thought.
100%. And look, modern Israel was founded by largely secular people. It was not necessarily Orthodox Jews that founded Israel back in 1948. In fact, today, actually, one of the more combative and testy domestic Israeli political issues is the debate over whether what the media refer to as so-called ultra-Orthodox Jews, in other words, Haredi Jews, whether they should be conscripted to serve in the IDF, in the military. And the reason that they're not is because it goes back to a compromise made in 1948, 1949 by Dia Ben-Gurion and the largely secular leaders of Israel. And the reason that they did that is because they assumed that the religious folks would basically just peter out, that religion after the Holocaust, after World War II, that there was really no future for religious Judaism there, that secular Jews would kind of lead Israel for perpetuity. So you're totally right there. That the country was founded by secular people. Nonetheless, there's a slight distinction between what secular means in Israel versus what secular means outside of Israel. So for instance, a lot of so-called secular Jews will still light a Sabbath candle on Friday, still do some sort of festive Sabbath dinner there, even if they're not fully keeping the law. It's generally just a more kind of traditional society for cultural inherited reasons than oftentimes here in the United States. But to your broader question here, which is about, God forbid, what would happen if Israel were annihilated, were wiped off the maps, something like that there. Look, in my mind, the children of Israel, the Jewish people and the state of Israel are the west tip of the spear against all the hegemonic forces that we're fighting against. So we talked about the Red-Green Alliance there. That is wokeism, Marxism, and then on the other hand, Islamism. Another interesting way that I view the state of Israel as being the tip of the spear against the forces that want to destroy us is the notion of globalism or global neoliberalism there. So let me just unpack that briefly, because I think it's actually an important point there. We have this concerted effort from folks at the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, a lot of these liberal transnational institutions that are essentially just trying to homogenize the masses. And by homogenizing the masses, they're trying really ultimately to eradicate the nation state itself. They're trying to eradicate national borders, to pretend that there are no real differences between human beings. Therefore, open borders is the only logical and rational policy. They're essentially just trying to bring into the world the old John Lennon song, Imagine. Imagine a world with no borders, with no religion, peace, kumbaya, pass the peace pipe, whatever there. And the point that I make in the book is that the capital S state of Israel is actually the tip of the spear against not just Islamism and Marxism or wokeism, but actually also against globalism, because modern Israel is a profoundly nationalist endeavor. It has a conscription, a military draft. They police their borders defiantly. The Israeli flag flies ubiquitously throughout the country. There is a very nationalist endeavor. And there's a reason for that, which was that going back thousands of years, once again, to the Bible itself, the ancient Israelite kingdom, when King David unites the tribes in Jerusalem, that's actually, in my reading of the Bible, that's actually really the antecedent to the nation state there, because he took these tribes, unites them under the banner of a united nation, And the borders are actually defined. There's no ambition for the ancient Israelites to go invade Egypt or Syria or Turkey, whatever there, because the borders were defined by God himself. So if you believe in the humility of defined borders, the nation state, that the tribes that form a nation should be in the nation there, then you have to have some sort of deep attachment to the Israeli state, because it is really kind of the anchor of the nation state model itself there. So this to me is just one of many reasons why the United Nations, why these groups condemn Israel over and over and over again. A lot of it is also just outright Jew hatred, but I think a lot of it's actually coming from a perhaps even deeper place of recognizing the state of Israel's role in the global order as this defined nationalist endeavor that really kind of defines global liberalism at large there. So yes, if you care about defending off wokeism, Islamism, and or global neoliberalism, and I care about fending off all three personally there, then there is a lot of reason, I think, to support the state of Israel.
Just to pick up on your point there, we have lived through an age when people have said, oh, nationalism's an evil thing, and you and I, I'm sure, would agree that ultranationalism can be very ugly indeed. Think the Third Reich, for example. But it is a reality, I think, that history demonstrates pretty clearly that the nation state turns out to be the best organising platform, if you like, for a free and prosperous people, giving opportunity to a vibrant and engaged citizenry to, if you like, reach their potential and their opportunity. Israel is a shining light in that regard. I mean, it simply can't deny it. Its living standards are amongst the highest in the world. Despite the relative lack of natural resources and so forth to hand. It's an innovative place. It's a place of great freedom. It is welcome to people from surrounding countries into its borders without losing its sense of nationality and identity, and in the face of those around who would not let Jewish people come into their lands. And then you contrast, somebody observed that Gaza really ought to be the Singapore of the Middle East. It could have been so different. We need to remember, I think, the value of the nation state and a home for people, and recognise that done properly, it can be a tremendous force for liberal values and for people to prosper.
Yeah, what's the old Churchill quote about democracy is essentially the least bad form of government out there? I mean that's kind of how I view the nation state when it comes to the international order of how peoples should be. I mean, the alternative to the intellectually humble nation state which knows its borders, the logical alternative is imperialism, and imperialism can come in the form of hard imperialism. So that's Imperial Japan in 1930s, 1920s. That's obviously the Third Reich. There's a very long and sordid history of peoples who do not believe in kind of a concrete, defined borders nation state of seeking to subjugate other peoples in the name of universal values and in the name of religion and some other thing there. But only when you accept the intellectual humility of the nation state, it really is there any chance, I think, of different peoples living according to their various traditions, their inherited customs, folk ways of life, their politics, their law, and so forth there, with any chance really of harmony among the nations there. So that is personally why I would proudly call myself a nationalist. I agree with you that there are many people historically that have abused that term and kind of paradoxically sought to invade others in the name of nationalism, which to me is actually something of an oxymoron, because to me, nationalism properly construed means that you live in humble, defined borders there. You're not seeking to kind of annex, scoop up new territories there. You're not necessarily Vladimir Putin, swooping into the Donbass region or anything like that there. But yes, I mean, Israel, again, is a tip of the spear against that, the tip of the spear against Islamism, wokeism, cultural Marxism, which to me are basically one and the same thing there. And these are all reasons really why I think people who even folks who have never even met a Jew in their life, and there's only 15, 16 million of us in the world. So there's, there's billions. There's literally billions of people who have never met a Jewish person there. But I think that there is just a deep-rooted reason why anyone who cherishes our collective inheritance should care not merely about the fate of this particular tiny state, which is the tip of the spear against the radical Muslims, against the DEI ideology and globalism life there, but also really just the fate of the Jewish people itself there, because John, if there's one thing that I know from reading history, there is not a single instance. There's literally not a single instance that I can point to. Not one of a society that has been better off after turning on its Jewish population. I literally cannot think of a single one. In fact, there's actually a decent case to be made. I would suggest that if the Germans hadn't been as rabidly anti-Semitic as they've been, if they hadn't kicked out all of the various scientists that worked there, the folks who came to the United States as part of what was known as Operation Paperclip there, if Albert Einstein had lived out his years in Berlin and not in Princeton, New Jersey, and so forth there, who knows how World War II might have ended there. There's not a single instance of a society actually being better off for turning on its Jews.
That's a powerful insight and a very real challenge to anyone listening. All right, well, let's move in towards the end of our conversation by saying where to now. There are some quite reasoned commentators in Australia who are saying that Netanyahu is now going too far, that he ought to pull back, that the PR war now is being lost because there's too much happening when it's not really necessary. And, of course, we do tend, I think, to rely too much on Palestinian sources for these things, but it does appear that there have been an incredible number of people killed, and perhaps the time has come to reconsider further military action. What are your views?
So when the war started and the tanks actually went into Gaza in late October 2023, Israel was pretty clear that they had two aims of this war effort. Those two aims were to retrieve the hostages and to eradicate Hamas as a political and military institution in Gaza. Now, the problem with announcing these lofty war aims is that you hold yourself to a standard that unless and until those war aims are met, then you have failed to win the war, meaning you have lost the war on your own prescribed terms. Now, I was of the opinion from the get-go that Israel made a strategic mistake in announcing these two war aims. I would have stuck with the foremost aim of trying to eradicate Hamas, the perpetrators of the worst pogrom against Jewish people since World War II. I obviously care deeply about the hostages, as any good human being should. But it appears to me, especially in hindsight, that was something of a counterproductive goal that has really deeply hamstrung Israel's ability to wage quick and efficient warfare in the Gaza Strip. The problem for Prime Minister Netanyahu at this point is not necessarily the casualty count, which a lot of people are quibbling about and debating it. And look, I mean, to be clear, every innocent human being lost is obviously a tragedy. I believe firmly in Genesis 1:27 that we're all made in the image of God there. But, people do die in wars, and that's a very good reason to not start wars in the first place there. And ultimately, I do feel that Hamas is morally culpable for every single person, civilian or combatant, that has been killed in Gaza since the 7th of October, 2023. Rather, the reason for Israel to try to wrap this thing up ASAP, and ideally they would have done so already, is, as you correctly know, that public sentiment is really turning, including here including here in the United States. So I mentioned earlier that Republican support has held pretty steady, but Democrat and independent support has really gone down the toilet there. And look, I mean, that's not a shock. I mean, that conservatives, Republicans support Israel more than the others there. But the longer this goes on there, the more difficult it's going to be for Israel to not necessarily even win the PR war because they've lost it, but just to really just contain the damage of the PR war there. And the most frustrating part for me as an American is that our president, President Trump, has basically been screaming from the rafters, "Bibi, finish this, go hard, finish this ASAP." He's basically been telling Netanyahu to go really hard, really quick, and finish this thing ASAP. And for XYZ reasons, I suspect that the hostages are part of it. The Israelis are not doing a great job of actually listening to that advice. Now, Netanyahu did have this press conference for foreign language media, maybe a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, somewhat recently there, trying to lay out the end game here as to what this looks like there. But this thing does have to end sooner rather than later. And again, I say that not necessarily due to the humanitarian concerns there. I am not of the opinion, God forbid, that a so-called genocide is being waged there. I mean, that's preposterous. If Israel wanted to commit genocide, they would drop a nuclear bomb. This is a nuclear country after all there. So there's no, but the war has to end for the very simple reason, nothing else, that the longer it goes on, the more difficult diplomatic cleanup is going to be for Israel on the other side once it is over.
And on that, then to conclude, we're now seeing France, Britain, Australia, Canada moving to recognise Palestine. I don't know what it is that they think they're recognising, for the simple reason that the Palestinians have consistently refused a two-state solution, and it's been offered to them, I think, 5 times in recent decades. They've turned it down every time. And until Hamas is out of the way, I don't see that it's in any way possible. What are your thoughts on that, if you like, winning the diplomacy war back and finding some sort of solution in hopefully coming months?
So the whole history of this conflict is so fascinating to me insofar as how quickly the world forgets. And this gets back to our earlier conversation about how the world doesn't really care about facts and logic and history, but nonetheless, a very, very brief history lesson nonetheless. So after the Allied powers won World War I, the great European powers that were victorious, namely Britain and France, carved up the Middle East. So this is how you got something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is formed by a British statesman named Sykes and a French statesman named Picot. That led to the various British mandates there. And this was kind of in 1920. There was a big conference called the San Remo Conference in San Remo, Italy, to finalize what the various British mandates for British colonial rule would look like. And at that time, there was known as the British Mandate for Palestine. And the British Mandate for Palestine had then 2 parts. There was mandatory Palestine, and there was the mandate for the Emirate of Transjordan. Now, the mandate for Palestine was all of the land of Israel, actually, all the way from the river to the sea, as the folks like to say. That actually was to be, per the Balfour Declaration, that was to be the Jewish home. It was actually the Emirate of Transjordan, which is contemporary Jordan today. That actually literally was the so-called Palestinian Arab state in the original two-state solution as the victorious European powers envisioned this about a century ago. Now the world does not really care for such facts and history and niceties there. So this is where we are today. But, in theory, that is the not so distant history when it comes to this actual conflict. The point that I've made when it comes to a so-called Palestinian state recognition, especially from a conservative American perspective there, from the perspective of someone who is a supporter of President Trump's conservative, nationalist, realist foreign policy, is I ask a very simple question that I think translates to an Australian audience quite easily as well, which is, what exactly is the claimed national interest? What exactly is the asserted national interest of the United States or the UK or France or Australia, any of these countries, in carving out yet another Muslim state there? The Muslims have plenty of states across Northern Africa and the Middle East. There is virtually no national interest that is served that I can think of by carving out yet another Muslim majority state in the heart of the Holy Land. God forbid to have access over Christian and Jewish holy sites there. It would essentially be a satrapy, a launching pad for Iran probably overnight. There is simply no interest that is served here other than pure, unabashed appeasement of the domestic Muslim voting population. That, to me, is what exactly is going on here in Australia, France, the UK, Canada. That's what I see, is I see a lot of leaders that are not thinking very clearly about the national interest. They're thinking simply about, we'll appease them in the short term for a very loud segment of the domestic population there, the so-called, free Palestine crowd there. But there's really no Western interest served whatsoever there. Rather, on the contrary, a Western interest is served from an emboldened Israel, an Israel that is closer to its core allies. And actually, paradoxically, it's only that emboldened Israel that is closer to the United States and its core Western allies there that then actually yields the fruits of peace in the first place. That's actually how Donald Trump got the Abraham Accord peace deals of 2020, when the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan made peace with Israel. They made peace with Israel not because Israel was weak, not because President Trump was trying to appease the Palestinian Arabs. On the contrary, he totally sidelined the Palestinian Arabs, and he went all in for U.S. relations. That's how you got these momentous generational peace deals there. So to me, that is actually the recipe for success. Again, peace, as we know, is achieved through strength, not weakness.
Well, it does rather strike me as an interesting reality that Palestine appears to have more support in many quarters of the West than it does in the Middle East.
That's exactly right. No, you look a lot of these countries, frankly. I mean, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, they actually have no tolerance for the so-called Palestinian flag, the red, green, black, white flag there, because they see that flag and they immediately think Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood. They're actually quite terrified of it. If you go into Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and you fly the Palestinian Arab flag, there is a very, very good chance that you will be arrested probably within 5 minutes. So, try doing that here in Columbia University in New York City or Harvard or any of these places there. Not only will you not be arrested, but you will be celebrated and probably lauded and given very high marks in your Middle Eastern Studies course or whatever, course it is you're taking from some invariably left-wing professor. So you're totally right. The so-called Palestinian Arab cause is cared about by Western leftists and Muslims in the Western diaspora, I guess let's call it there. They care of this a lot more than the actual leadership of these Arab countries. Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, he doesn't care really at all about the Palestinian Arab issue. I mean, this is a very, very poorly kept secret. He truly, earnestly does not care at all. The UAE, they really, really, really don't care at all. You have some Muslims there in the more rural parts in particular that do care a lot about it. But the leadership of these countries, they really just don't care at all there. And increasingly, actually, they see the importance of being on decent terms with Israel, because the more emboldened Israel is, the more that Israel kind of showcases its military prowess by taking out Hamas jihadis, Hezbollah jihadis, by clearing the way for President Trump to take out the Iranian nuclear sites there. The more that Israel does what Israel does best when it comes to fighting radical Islamic jihad, the more that the non-Islamist moderate Arab countries are warm to try to embrace her as well.
Well, Josh, here's to the restoration of reason and revelation. Here is to a rebalancing so that they're in sync, our hearts and our minds. We've got to be careful what we wish for, it seems to me, because there's a lot of, frankly, naivety around that's allowing some very, very evil ideas to take hold.
There's a lot out there, and we the point is, and I guess I'll end on this, because this is basically the closing argument of my book, actually, John, is that Jews and Christians have to stand shoulder to shoulder. There is no future for us without the original people of the book, without this original kind of enduring reminder that God exists, that he is real, that there is truth, that there is a particular people that tries to live according to his laws. Western civilization does not survive without the Jews. Western civilization definitely does not survive without Christians, who themselves built Western civilization there. And we know that because it is our holy books, it is the Bible, it is Scripture that built this entire edifice itself. I mean, again, so much of what we take for granted there. I mean, even the notion of private property rights. I think a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, think that John Locke concocted property rights. Total nonsense. The entire notion of private property rights goes back really to the Hebrew Bible there. I mean, so much of these things that have built the literal cornerstones, the literal foundations, go back to the Bible. So unless Jews and Christians, Jews, Protestants, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, unless we are all standing shoulder to shoulder, we're not going to have any chance whatsoever of turning back the tide against the very real forces that want to subjugate us, by which I primarily mean wokeism, Islamism, and global neoliberalism. And again, the point here is that on a geopolitical chessboard, it is the capitalist state of Israel that is the canary in the coal mine against all three threats. And then from a human being vantage point, it is the children of Israel, the Jewish people, that are the canary in the coal mine against those same threats.
Josh, thank you. And I just reiterate that a man I certainly have a very high regard for his intellect, Bob Hawke, just said, and you said it in a different way, that when the bell tolls for Israel, it tolls for all mankind. Your challenge there for us to think of a people who have benefited when they've turned on the Jewish people in their midst. That's quite a challenge. I have a great interest in history, and I think it's a very real challenge and a sobering one. You've been very generous with your time. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, John.